Moonlight lay flat across the prairie, a silver sheet over dry grass and low tin roofs. The camp smelled of smoke and tack oil, horses' breath steaming in the chill. Nalin moved like a shadow through it, every step measured, every breath a small permission to keep going. Her daughter, small and limp with sleep, was bundled close beneath her chin. Chenoa's lashes feathered in the cold. Her cheeks were thin but warm against Nalin's collarbone. The child's fingers clenched at the edge of Nalin's shawl, an anchor and a promise. If they found her here, if the elders learned she had taken her child into the vaqueros' camp in the dead of night, the price would be heavy. Exile had already seared lines into her ribs. Shame had been a constant companion for many months. Yet hunger was a louder voice than shame when a small mouth went empty, and fear shrank under the shape of the child she carried. She had wrapped Chenoa in every scrap that remained untaken. She had tied a coil of rope at her waist and a small medicine wrap against her heart. She had thought the crossing through the sleeping camp a better risk than another night listening to her daughter's stomach growl. The horses in their corrals lifted their heads and snorted as she passed. A lantern guttered on a post. The light caught and slid along the rail of a porch. Voices drifted faintly. Laughter, the clink of a tin cup. Nalin kept to shadows, ducked between cedar posts, listened. The ranch lay ahead, its fence made a little line of darkness against the broader sky. She needed a hand to feed them, a hearth to warm Chenoa, work to trade for bread. More than that, she needed a place where the child could be safe from the cold of being unwanted. She paused beneath the porch of the main house, where a lantern threw a mellow pool. A pair of boots lay at the step, the worn leather soft with use. Nalin set Chenoa down for a moment on the shadowed boards and smoothed the child's hair back from her forehead, the small face upturned, breathing like a bellows in sleep. For a heartbeat, the mother let herself imagine the worst, the elder's harsh eyes, a rope, a child torn away, and that image hardened her resolve. She placed one hand on the planks and lifted herself, the porch board still warm from the day's sun. When she knocked, it was a careful low tapping, like a bird tapping at a window. The knock did not bring shouted alarm. Instead, the door opened to a man whose face was partly in shadow, his jaw unshaven, a blanket looped over his shoulder. Will Harrison took in the child first, then the woman. He did not shout. He did not reach for a gun. He held the doorway like a hinge and watched. "You're not a thief," he said softly. The words were an offering he did not have to make. Nalin's mouth was dry. She kept her voice small. "Hunger," she said. "My girl, no more food." Will stepped back, his face a slow map of decisions. A woman's hand, calloused and patient, appeared at his elbow. She was older, her hair streaked with silver, and she watched Nalin with eyes that had learned to read beyond the surface of things. Martha's presence was a quiet counterbalance. There was no quick morality in her face, only an assessment that looked for need and weighed consequence. "You can come in," Will said. "For a while, we have work if you can do it." Nalin's relief was so sudden it almost took her breath. She had not expected generosity. She had imagined bargaining, some stern refusal. Yet she kept her posture steady. Accepting alms had been a wound before. She would trade labor for bread. She would not be a supplicant. They gave Chenoa a blanket by the hearth, a bowl of stew that was thin but warm and full of barley. Nalin watched her daughter eat and felt the world rearrange itself in a private way. Sounds softened, the dangerous edges blurred. Will sat across from them, his hands large and steady, his eyes knowing a kind of caution and an openness that felt like an unspoken contract, help in exchange for honest work. When the house quieted and Chenoa slept, Nalin sat at the edge of the porch and unwrapped the small medicine roll she carried. It contained roots and leaves pressed between soft cloth, the training of a woman who had been taught by the old ones. How to stop a fever, how to set a sprain, how to ease a cow's labor. She believed in remedies that lived in the dirt and the air, in the taste of boiled bark and the patience of hands on an injured flank. Will watched her, a question folded in his brow. "You can work the herd?" he asked. "I can mend and feed," she replied. "I know the plants. I can help the sick beasts." Martha, who had been listening, inclined her head. "We could use a steady hand," she said. "We're light here. Frank keeps the men moving, but he's not a healer of any kind." There was only a single thing left to negotiate: trust. Trust in a stranger in the middle of night is a coin with many edges. Nalin accepted a corner of the porch to sleep on, with Chenoa curling at her hip. She laid the medicine roll under her pillow, folded her shawl as armor, and let herself sleep in fits and starts, an animal that knew the shape of danger even within shelter. If you're moved by this opening, like and subscribe to follow the rest of Nalin's story. Dawn came slow and raw. The sky burned along the horizon before the air caught. Nalin rose before the household, tied her hair back with a strip of cloth, and stepped into a workday that smelled of sweat, hay, and the metallic tang of early light. Will showed her the layout of the ranch in broad strokes, the corral to the east where foals stamped and trimmed their edges, the barn where the sacks of feed slumped, the lean-to where old tack hung like sleeping beasts. He worked alongside her for the first morning, passing tools and explaining names, simple, practical things that did not presume the history of those who listened. The men who worked the ranch treated Nalin with a cool assessment. Frank, the foreman, had a mouth that was used to iron and suspicion. He watched her as if cataloguing assets and liabilities. The others murmured among themselves, a joke here, a glance there, curiosity leavened with the customary roughness of those who had seen too many wanderers. Nalin answered with labor. Her hands did not shy from callus and rope. She fed latrine horses and brushed out manes that held the sun's dust like a story. The rhythm of work steadied her. The mundane liturgy of chores was a kind of sanctuary. She swept out stalls with a broom that had been kept in the same corner for years, the bristles softened to use. She lifted sacks of grain until her shoulders burned, and when she was given a knife to cut out a particularly stubborn burr, she did so without complaint. It was on the third day that she met the cow that would change how she was seen. They called the animal Big Mara, a broad-backed mother whose udder had swelled and who had become skittish after a bout of infection in the herd. The men had tried liniments and were almost ready to put her down for fear she would poison the milk or carry disease. Frank's voice had been curt that morning, clipped with an impatience that had become a habit. "She's worth more dead than sick," he muttered, and the other men nodded like men who had decided on a hard thing. Nalin watched the cow from the corral rail. Big Mara's breath came ragged. Her sides collapsed in the way of an animal that had given all it could and was now hollowing out. Nalin slipped between the posts with a patience she had learned under other skies. She ran her hand down the cow's flank, feeling heat and the thinness of muscle. The animal flinched but did not try to hurt her. It recognized the touch of someone who had tended beasts and who came without the scent of fear. "What do you think you'll do?" Frank asked bitterly as he approached, his boots scuffing the earth. "She needs a poultice," Nalin said simply. "An herb for the fever, a clean cloth, a drain for the swelling if it is abscessed. You have to hold her calm. Speak like you would to a woman in labor." A ripple of snorts and skeptical mutters moved among the men. They were unfamiliar with a woman who spoke of tending cattle as if it were a prayer. But Will stepped forward, the look in his eyes not of mockery but of calculation. He turned to the cow, to Frank, to the men. "Let her try," he said. They worked slow and close. Nalin had them calm the animal with soft husk tones, her voice low and plain as water. She instructed them how to lift the leg, where to press, how to steady breathing. When they found the infection behind a flank, she showed them how to make an incision and drain the accumulated poison without angering the animal. When she wrapped the wound, she tied the bandage with a steady knot that would not slip. Big Mara's eyes focused in a different way as the fever broke. The shivering eased, the guttural noises less frantic. It was not magic, and Nalin never called it such. It was knowledge folded into action. The right herb, the careful hand, the patience to wait while body mended. The men watched as the animal's breathing steadied. They had seen other beasts die under hands that could not be quiet. They saw now that she had skill. After hours of work, Will offered Nalin a tobacco-roughened grin, a private approval that did not need a blessing. Frank, who had been the most dismissive, rubbed his neck with a stone of respect and found words that were smaller than apology but larger than the slights before. "You did good," he said. They fed the cow a meager handful of softened grain to help her body regain strength. Word of the rescue spread across the ranch in the language of practical things. How she had held the rope when Big Mara panicked, how she had soaked cloths in sage and boiled root. the way she had spoken to the animal until it found the will to breathe evenly. That afternoon, a boy who mended the fences brought her a small portion of corn and a half-rotten apple, hands extending the gift with a grin that suggested admiration. A cook left a bowl of stew on the step for her that night without asking. Each offering was small, but together they formed an accounting of trust. Chenoa watched her mother with wide, questioning eyes as the household's attitude shifted. The child had an appetite that returned along with food in her belly. She listened to the men's jokes, to the rhythm of boots on boards, and began to mimic the way Will tipped his hat when he passed. She stayed close to Martha in the evenings, where the older woman would smooth her hair and unspool stories in the manner of small measured truths: how to know a good loaf, how to mend a shirt, how to read a name on a ledger. Martha taught the girl to trace letters with her finger on the back of a pantry door, and Chenoa laughed when the letters made houses in her imagination. In the slow hours, Will and Nalin found themselves sharing tasks where silence deepened into something else. It was in the ways their hands met, passing feed, tying a cinch, untying a stubborn knot, that a closeness grew. Will would stand shoulder to shoulder with her at the gate, their breaths fogging in the morning, and they would plan where to mend fence or how to move the yearlings. He was careful with his words, choosing them like a man who understood the cost of promise. Nalin gave nothing that she would not keep. She spoke of the child, and of the medicine she carried, and of her exile with an economy that protected what could not be exposed. There were small days when the ranch would feel almost like a life stitched from possibility. They shared bread under the same sky. Will taught Chenoa to hold a hammer with respect, and the child's small fingers bunched around the handle like a secret. She learned under Martha's patient finger that a name could be written and read and kept. The rhythm of daily work became a language of belonging. Even so, shadows ran beneath the edges. Men who had watched too many travelers come and go kept their own counsel. A slur of gossip circulated in low voices. Talk of the tribe that had cast Nalin out, of the shame that followed a woman who had been told to leave. Will heard whispers and did not turn them away. Instead, he met them with quiet resolves, making no promises to fix history, only to stand by the yard he oversaw. It was an imperfect protection, but it was something. When the rains came late that month, they did so in a stubborn drizzle that made the earth smell of new. Nalin walked the pasture that morning, checking the fences, feeling the sag of weathered rope under her palms. The work kept her from thinking too long about the thing that waited in the dark beyond the fields, the old curses and the tribunals of custom. To survive was a series of small actions: lift the feed, stitch the torn harness, mix the poultice. Each repair was a rebuke to exile. Word of the cow had reached beyond the men who worked the ranch. A neighboring homestead sent a hand who had come to trade for repairs. He thanked Nalin with a gesture of respect and spoke her name like a thing he wanted to remember. The ranch's children had begun to call Chenoa by a diminutive name he had once used with his own sister. Names were bridges, and small bridges could become roads. All of that would have been enough to settle some souls, but the world holds echoes. On a late afternoon, a rider came hard into the yard, raising dust that painted the faces of the men like a new war. He did not carry the measured gait of a neighbor with news of seed. His horse had come at speed, and his face was set like a man who had carried a long thing inside. He spoke in quick, sharp syllables to Will, and the two of them leaned into words that pulled the others close. "He says the elders marked the woman's face in the winter," Frank reported later, his voice low. "They say she was cast out for reasons I don't know. They say a child belongs to her people. They want the girl back." The words landed like stones. The men paused in their tasks as if some animal had crossed the path. Nalin stood with a sack of seed in her arms, and the weight of it steadied her. She felt the old fear press back, like a wave that had been building in the dark. No one could be surprised that their past followed them like a shadow. The question was whether the present would stand for her to keep her child. Will's response was simple and plain. He set his jaw and looked at her as if he would carve a line into the day. "She's with us," he said. "We care for her. She eats on this porch. She sleeps with us. No one takes her without reason." But reason in these matters was not a thing you could always hold. Rules older than men's grudges moved like roots under the grass. Nalin felt the history of her people, how a woman's misstep had been punished, how a community's honor could demand restitution. coil in her mind. She was not naive. She had not expected to be welcomed without consequence. She had crossed into enemy camp at midnight because hunger not only sharpens the mind, but narrows it to the child at your breast. She had bargained with danger because the alternative was worse. When the first real test came, it was not in a courtroom or on a gallows, but in the corral at dusk, with the light slanting and all the men gathered. A neighbor had delivered a message. The tribe's emissary, a man of cautious gait named Roland, was coming in 2 days with word from his elders and a rider to swear the claim. The words moved through the camp like wind. It was not yet a conflict. It was a summons. Nalin did not shrink from it. She sat by the hearth that night and held Chenoa on her lap, fingering the child's small ear, tracing its soft curve. The girl's breathing was even, and there was a mark of something between them that felt like a vow. Nalin smoothed Chenoa's hair back and told herself quietly that she would answer truth with truth. If asked, she would say what she had done and why. She would speak the plain things that only a mother could say, the sound of hunger at night, the weight of exile, the small miracles of a child's laughter. She had agency, she had planned, she had chosen. She had taken the risk because the value of the child's life exceeded the risk's measure. The ranch could not give her back her tribe, not the way home. But in the steady work and the small kindnesses, there was the possibility of something else. A place where dignity might be rebuilt through honest labor. A place where a child could grow without the constant echo of being unwanted. The next morning, Nalin woke before dawn and took her poultices to the barn. Big Mara was better. She did not wobble as she once had. The men greeted Nalin with nods that were less guarded than before. Will handed her a basin of water and a small loaf of bread without comment. The bread was rough and warm, and she accepted it with hands that spoke gratitude without asking for more. At midday, before the rider arrived, Nalin sat on the fence and watched Chenoa play by the gate, her small boots kicking up dust. Will stood a little way off with his arms folded, the picture of a man who had chosen a posture and intended to keep it. Martha moved between them like a thread. An observation here, a patching of a dress there. The ranch hummed with its chores and its quiet alliances. When the riders came that afternoon, they did not thunder in like conquerors. They moved with the slow gravity of people who carried old claims. Roland dismounted with a respectful bow and spoke to Will first, then to the gathered group. He spoke of their elders, of the rules that governed kin and belonging, of the pain that came when a woman left the place she was born. His words were not claws. They were formal, measured. Will answered in the same tone, stating that the girl had been fed and clothed, and that any question of guardianship would be met with a fair hearing. There was a suggestion that the law of men on these plains could be weighed by men who had years and reason behind them. Nalin watched as the men spoke and felt the hollow in her chest fill with a hot steadiness. She would not cower. If they wanted to bring her before elders or talk of obligations, she would go. She would present herself, speak for Chenoa, and defend her child with every plain word she had. But even before any formal meeting, the old wheels of prejudice and testing had begun turning. A second test came not from words, but from the life of the ranch. The weanling foals began to suffer a contagion that spread through the young stock, and with it came fear. The men debated culling. Supplies were thin. Fear is a keen angle in communities that must survive off the land. They do not indulge hope when their herds are at stake. If the ranch could not endure, none of their arguments would matter. Nalin stepped forward without drama. She had watched the foals cough, seen their flanks hitch with the effort to breathe when the dust filled their lungs. She knelt by a trembling chest and put her palm where heat rose. "It is in the environment," she told them. "The bedding is damp. The feed is stale. Move them to dry ground. We must strip the wool near the nose, make an inhalation steam, and feed a broth to ease the fever. Use willow for the fever. For the cough, a decoction of yarrow will loosen them." They did not believe her at first. No one wanted to waste the time. But Will watched the foal and then watched her, and something like the earlier calculation returned. "Do what she says," he told Frank. "We can't lose more than we can afford." They moved the animals, scrubbed the troughs, burned out the bedding that held damp, mixed the decoctions as she instructed. Nalin worked alongside the men until the sun sat low, boiling herbs and steadying a foal that trembled so hard its teeth chattered. She pressed cloths to the animal's flanks and kept her voice low, singing lines her mother had taught. a cadence not of liturgy, but of patience. When the first fall's shallow breath deepened into a full intake, the men stared at the change as if they had seen rain where they had expected drought. These were small savors of trust, accrued like coins in a jar. The ranch began to tilt toward acceptance in the ways that matter. A softer look when she passed, a shared joke with the cook, a place to lay a blanket without question. Nalin kept some reserve. The past was not rewritten by a cow saved or a foal tended, but she allowed herself a small generosity. A laugh shared with Will over a misthrown rope, a hand offered to Chenoa as the child attempted to climb a low rail. At dusk, as the lamps were lit and the supper dishes piled, there was a knock at the gate. The rider Will had expected arrived with a folded paper and a voice that carried more than words. He asked to speak with Nalin alone. The men drew close and then stepped back like people who have learned to give space when a woman prepares to speak for herself. Nalin stepped forward, Chenoa clinging to her skirt. She felt the old eyes of the elders like the wind that comes before a storm, but she also felt the steady weight of the men who had come to stand behind her, of Will and Martha, who had made themselves a strange kind of family. She took the rider's paper, and the script on it was formal, an account of claim, a summons, the language of obligation and right. It was not delivered as a threat, but as a procedural thing. She read it in the cold light of evening, and then raised her head. The paper did not make the choice for her. Her mouth formed a line of decision. She would not be bullied into silence by ink and stamp. She would answer with the plain, stubborn speech of a mother. "Bring them," she said. "Bring the elders. I will speak and they will know my voice." Around her, men shifted. Frank cast his expression to one of reluctant respect. Martha placed her hand on Chenoa's head and gave a soft, almost invisible nod. Will looked at Nalin like a man preparing to keep a promise he had not yet fully shaped. The rider rode away to carry word of the meeting back to the elders, and the ranch settled into a waiting that was not idle, but full of a kind of attention that made the next days feel longer. The days that followed were a mesh of ordinary chores and the slow preparation for conversation. Nalin walked the perimeters, checked the fences, and mended more than rope. She mended the way she moved through the world, holding her head steady in the face of stares, returning greetings, answering questions without flinching. Chenoa blossomed in small ways. She hummed while fetching feed. She learned to tie a simple knot. She repeated words that Martha taught. Letters turned into shapes she could place in her mouth like seeds. But the knowledge that her past could return hovered at the edge like a hawk. Nalin knew that the ranch's goodwill could be practical and fragile. She also knew that the tribe's claims were not a simple legal matter. They were the pull of a culture that measured kinship by blood and by law that had long roots. She had no desire to erase her origins. She wanted simply the right to choose, an autonomy for her child the way the child's small hands grasped for the world. One evening, as the sky turned a kind of bruised purple, Will found Nalin mending a blanket in the shed. He sat a short distance away on an overturned bucket. The shadows made him somber, and his voice came quietly. "If it comes to a choice," he said, "you tell me what you want, and I'll stand with you. I won't make it for you. That's not my way." Nalin met his gaze. His words carried the respect he had practiced since the night she had knocked on his door. She considered the lines on his face, the way his shoulders carried the day's work, the deep honesty behind the offer. "I know," she replied. "I don't want favors. I want a life where my child is safe. If that is with you, then she will choose. If not, then she will not. I will not bargain her." They spoke little after that. Words were not needed to form the sort of understanding between people who had come to trust each other through work and care. The test would come in the elders' faces, in the old laws. For now, they prepared. For now, they built the muscles of a life that might withstand it. And then a small thing happened that became large in its consequences. A boy from the neighboring homestead, Julian, who mended fences and had a grin that never quite left his face, brought with him a worn tape measure and a ledger he'd found in a chest marked with an old family name. He had been sorting through boxes of a barn estate and had discovered a record of a man who once lived in the same territory, a keeper of fates and borders. The ledger contained names and notes about migrations, a small dry account that suggested some families had moved and married across lines that were older than memory. One small entry noted a child born to a woman who later left in winter. The script had an odd bend to it. the sort of writing that made the eye slow. It was not a declaration, not a judgment, it was mere notation. But in a world of paper and claim, notations like that had teeth. People held them up to give shape to conversations. When the ledger reached Will, he read it and then showed it to Nalin in the late light. It did not prove anything, it merely suggested complexity. For Nalin, it was a reminder that histories were never simple, that many things lay under the skin of a person that neither paper nor speech could wholly capture. She folded the ledger and tucked it under her arm like an invitation to a conversation she had not been asked to join. The sun fell, the ranch settled, men gathered to swap stories and pass bowls of stew. Chenoa sat with Martha, tracing letters in the dust with a stick. Nalin watched her daughter laugh at something Will had said, and the sound lodged in her like a stone in a nest. For tonight at least, the child belonged to that laughter. It was neither stolen nor given, but present, a thing formed in the present tense. Night came then with its long depth, and with it the knowledge that the elders' arrival could be sooner than they expected. Nalin sat outside the door, the cold pressing at her shoulders, thinking of the crossing that had led her here. The memory of stepping through the sleeping camp to a porch with a lantern had the fresh edges of a wound, and the soft tissue of a triumph too. She had risked a lot for Chenoa. She would not flinch now. In the dark, she thought of Dakota, the name that passed in the men's whispers with respect and a memory of slow decisions, and she wondered what the elder would see in her eyes if they met. She wondered if reconciliation could look like the yard they had rebuilt, a place that did not erase who someone had been but allowed new connections to form on honest ground. And beneath all of that, a new thing hummed, a possibility that was not declared but was taking shape in quiet acts. Two people who watched the child, who traded work and jokes, who did not presume to own one another, but also did not shy from standing up when the world asked them to defend what they had made. It was a fragile thing, but in the building of it lay a kind of hope that could feed a small life. As the ranch settled into sleep, a rider at the gate looked east toward the line of trees, where the faint shape of a distant camp was a darker smudge against the stars. The rider's horse stamped, and the man rubbed his jaw, thinking of journeys and of messages carried across long days. Nalin closed her eyes and listened to the horse's breathing, the soft scrape of wind through the eaves. She held Chenoa closer, feeling the child's slow heartbeat against her own. Whatever would come in the days ahead, she had chosen this place by a simple measure. It kept her daughter fed and taught her hands to work. It was a beginning, and beginnings have their own fragile courage. In the still of the night, she let herself hope. Dawn came with a brittle light that carved the yard into honest shapes. Men and horses were already awake. The quiet hum of chores had a sharper edge because the elders would arrive before the sun reached its full warmth. Nalin dressed Chenoa in the small jacket Martha had mended and ran her fingers over the child's hair until the knots eased. She felt the tension like a physical thing beneath her ribs. Expectation made small and steady the way a horse holds itself before a run. Riders appeared along the road as if the land had delivered them up. A measured line of horses, backs low and careful, their riders wrapped against the morning. Dakota rode at the head, a man whose age had mapped itself into a face that held more stories than immediate judgment. He dismounted with the economy of someone who did not need ceremony to assert a presence. Around him were others from the camp, some thin with weather, some lined with years, none given to haste. They moved through the yard with a gravity that quieted laughter. Will met them at the gate, his posture even, his hand falling to the rail rather than to a weapon. Behind him the men of the ranch stood like a planned defense, not hostile but steady. The two groups regarded one another with that old frontier courtesy, eyes that took measure and set a pace for words. Dakota's first glance fell to Chenoa, who hovered by Nalin's skirt. The child looked up with a boldness that belonged to her years. She had not yet learned to cloak herself with suspicion. Dakota's expression softened in a way that was small and immediate. He looked then to Nalin as if reading a map she had drawn with the lines of her face. "You came at night," he said in a voice that carried the authority of someone who had seen many crossings. His words were not an accusation but a fact. "You left your camp." There was a pause, and in that pause was the long reckoning of custom and blood. "Why?" Nalin held the child so they both stood steady. She spoke plainly, each phrase shaped to be understood. "We had no food." I walked across this place because my daughter cried in the dark. I asked for work. I have stayed, and I have paid my days with labor. I do not hide what I am." There were murmurs on both sides, the ranch hands uneasy, elders listening. Dakota did not interrupt. He watched Nalin's hands, the way they had the ease of someone who had done what she now spoke of. He turned his face slightly, considering the land and the people who claimed it. One of the elders stepped forward, a woman with a lined mouth and a gaze that did not soften for anyone. "The law of our people has always protected the child," she said. "The matter is not only hunger, it is kin. We must know where the child will learn to be a person of our people, who will teach her the names and the songs, to take a child to a place that does not honor those things." Her tone was not cruel, it was careful. Will answered before Nalin could, because sometimes there was a need for plainness that would not come from a tongue not used to it. "She will be taught the work she needs to live," he said. "Martha will teach the girl to read and count. She will grow here under our roof and under her mother's care. If there is harm, bring it forward and we will talk it through." Frank's jaw tightened at the edge of the group, but even he did not speak until asked. The ranch's men watched like a waiting crowd. They had seen Nalin with the animals. They had seen her steady hands calm a beast too sick to fight. That had carried weight on their eyes. Dakota frowned as if unrolling some old concern. He looked to Nalin again and asked what others might have asked more softly. "Do you want to be part of their life here, or do you wish to return?" The question contained both the possibility of acceptance and the echo of an old demand. Nalin squared her shoulders. She was not willing to give her child to a life where the child's agency would be barred. "I want my daughter to be safe," she answered. "I want her to know where she came from. I will not cut the name from her, but I will not give her to a place that starves her. Let her choose when she is old enough to know both." A low sound moved through Dakota's circle, an intake like wind. The elders spoke among themselves in tones that involved years and memory. Those words were not meant for the ranch to understand. They were a private exchange. For Nalin, the waiting felt like a test whose answer depended on the way these voices bent. When Dakota turned again, he held in his hand a small object, a necklace, its cord darkened by use, a pendant of hammered silver that caught the sun and did not glare. It was not ornate. It was the kind of thing that carried its own history in the way it had been handled and the scuff of hands that had touched it. Nalin recognized the pendant in some vague way, an emblem perhaps of family, perhaps of lineage. The sight of it tightened something in her chest. Dakota's voice was softer than before. "This belonged to one who loved a time and place," he said. "It is a token of memory. We bring it not to punish, but to ask that you remember where you are from." But a child's coming of age is not only bound to a piece of silver, it is bound to those who raise her. He looked at Will, and then at the ranch hands who had come to form the child's present. Then he looked at Nalin, and for a moment the yard held nothing but the tiny immense thing of the decision. One of the visiting elders, a man whose face had a thinness that spoke of winters, spoke plainly. "A child chooses. We came to ask, but a child may say what she will." It was the kind of turning Nalin had hoped would come, but had not expected to hear so bluntly in the open. She reached down and took Chenoa's small hand. "Do you want to come with me?" she asked the child softly. Chenoa's thumb found Nalin's palm with the easy trust of a child who had known a particular warmth since infancy. The girl's voice slipped out like tidewater, clear, small, honest. "I want to stay with Mama," she said, "and with Aunt Martha, and Will, and the horses." It was less a list than a map of what the child felt safe with. Dakota watched the child's face with a gravity that made the air still. He seemed to measure the way the child held her mother's hand, the small way she had learned to laugh when Will tossed a hay bale. The elders exchanged glances again, this time with a softer edge. They consulted in whisper for a time that stretched. There were objections, as there must be whenever old order stood opposite new life. One of the elders, an uncle perhaps, opened his mouth with a memory of custom and duty. "If we permit this now," he said, "we must know whether the child will remember the teachings of her people. Will she be taught our names? Will she be shown where she comes from?" His worries were not cruel. They asked what every community asks when a child's education is at stake. Nalin answered with the force of experience and the humility of someone who had borne loss. I will teach her. I will not hide her. She will learn your names. She will know where she came from. I will not cut the cord. But I ask you to let us shape a future where she can choose for herself when she is old enough." There was a quiet between the words, and then Dakota stepped forward. He had watched Nalin move among animals. He had seen the way she spoke to the sick and to the small. He had seen who she had become in the days she had been under the ranch's roofs. Power in a man who had known hardship often reads as discretion. He used it now, not to close a door but to open one. "We will not take the child by force," he said finally, his voice a careful bridge. "We will return this token." He reached out and handed the necklace to Nalin rather than the child, as a reminder of where she is from. "If she wishes to learn our songs, we will teach her. If she wishes to belong here, we will accept that too, knowing that belonging need not be only one place. This is not an easy thing to decide, but it is not an impossible thing either." When he spoke, the ranch breathed as if relief had found a new shape. Some of the men blinked, surprised at the measure of compromise. Frank's mouth tightened and then softened. Martha's hand moved to Chenoa in a slow gesture of blessing. The elders who had been prepared to demand a return of the child stepped back, gnarled hands easing as if the strain had been placed somewhere else. Nalin's fingers closed on the silver pendant like a small seizure of history. She did not wear it immediately. She held it to her chest for a moment, the metal cool and honest against her skin. There was no shout of triumph, no vanquished enemy, only a quiet that was the sound of a new rope being tied between two stakes. The necklace was a token, not a binding. It signified the possibility of belonging that included more than one home. Dakota nodded once toward Will and then to the gathered men. "We will come when we are asked," he said. "We will teach as we can. We will not take what is not offered. Remember, children listen and they learn. They keep the world whole when they are taught both sides of it." Will stepped forward then and lowered his voice. "If you come," he said, "we will listen. We will not pretend to know all that you need to make a person whole, but we have given a place that fed a child and taught her to read. We will stand by that." There was no triumph in his tone, only the plainness of a man making a position he would hold to the end. The negotiation had been public and hard and honest. In the space afterward, Dakota accepted Martha's invitation to sit near the hearth, and the elders spoke in softer words as if to build a map of how they might visit and teach. The yard turned into a place where hands passed bread across lines, and the first small steps toward a shared life were made in the practical currency of hospitality. That night, the ranch cooked more than usual. A table was set with plain things, bread, stew, roasted meat, and both groups sat with a mutual awkwardness that gentled into conversation. Chenoa's laughter threaded through the talk. Men swapped stories about animals and weather. Elders told a few of their tales, not as lessons but as accounts of life. The fire kept the cold at bay and made faces into friendlier shapes. Dakota spoke of how names were given and some of the stories that tied a person to the land. Martha spoke of sewing and bread with the same slow love. By the time the moon rose, there was a small gathering around a low bowl where people dipped bread and passed cups. Frank, who had been lantern-faced with a hardness, found himself trading a gruff joke with an elder about a stubborn mule. Will walked across the yard and stood with Nalin for a moment as she handed Chenoa to Dakota so the elder could press the pendant into the child's small palms. The scene had the intimacy of a page turned, the kind of modest change that alters the course of things without heraldry. After the elders had gone and the horses' breathing slowed into their night rhythm, Will and Nalin sat on the porch steps where the boards were still warm from the day. The pendant rested on Nalin's knee, the way a conversation rests when it has been completed for the time being. "You didn't have to fight it alone," Will said quietly. "I did not ask to be alone," Nalin answered. I chose this for my child." There was a little edge in her voice that was not anger, but the memory of the crossing at midnight, the decision she had made when hunger left no room for pride. Will's hand found hers and held it without drama. "I know," he said, "and I know what you gave up to make that choice. You can stay here and be who you are, if you want it." Nalin looked at him with a complexity that was honest. She had not come for romance, she had come for survival. Yet the days had shown her a man who had been careful in how he offered himself, neither planting himself as savior nor shrinking from commitment. She felt an affection that was honest and tempered by respect. "I will stay," she said after a moment, not as a surrender, but as a decision that had been tested. "Not because I am paid for it." She smiled slightly, hitting the place where bluntness and affection met. "But because it is the place I chose. Because the child will learn many things here, and because you asked me to choose rather than telling me what to do." Will exhaled, and then closed his hand over hers. There was no show of rings or flowery vow. Instead, he reached into his pocket and produced a small strip of leather with a knot at the end, a simple thing that had the weight of something made to last. He offered it to her quietly. "I want you to have this," he said. "Not a promise to own you, but a promise to stand with you, to keep this place true, and to make it a home." Nalin accepted it. She tied it around her wrist with a knot that matched the one he had tied. The gesture was small and private, but to both it felt like a pact. Two people promising to take responsibility for what they had chosen together. The days that followed settled into an altered rhythm. The elders made occasional visits and taught small things. Songs in the evenings when the campfire burned. Names of plants that Nalin already knew, but that were slotted into a different shape when spoken in her language. Chenoa ran between the two worlds and learned to trace letters by Martha's light and to listen to Takota's stories by the fire. She learned to call a horse's name in both tongues, to bind a bandage with the skill of both traditions, and in this stitching of knowledge something deepened. Identity became not a single place, but a braided rope. Winter loosened its hold and then yielded to a spring that felt fresher from months of cooperation. Big Mara recovered and bore another calf with the quiet dignity of a creature that had been tended and not simply used. The herd prospered, small and stubborn under Will's care and Nalin's steady hands. Frank's gruffness had not entirely left him, but it had softened into a kind of practical respect. The ranch's men would sometimes mock one another, but there was no cruelty in it now. Even the jokes carried affection. There were moments of ordinary tenderness that anchored the larger change. Martha taught Chenoa to mend a shirt and to make a small knot that kept a button in place. She taught the child to trace letters on the back of an envelope so the girl could practice in private. Will showed Chenoa how to saddle a pony and then stepped back to let Nalin correct the child's grip when it was wrong, neither of them trying to muscle the other out of the parent's role. These small exchanges did more than any speech. They built a family from the matter-of-fact acts that sustain life. One evening, after the day's chores and a late, near-perfect supper, the ranch gathered near the corral. A neighbor had passed along word of a barn raising not far off, and in the glow of the lanterns people sang. The song was rough and full of the kinds of voices that had not practiced harmony, but in the clatter and the holler there was a shared joy. Children played around the posts, and Chenoa ran with the unself-conscious speed of youth. Takota was there, sitting beside the post, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been accepted into a circle of people who had chosen to be practical and kind. He watched the small bodies race and then turned to Nalin. "You have made a space," he said. "It is not the only space a person may have. It is not less for being new." Nalin met his eyes and nodded. There was between them a recognition of what had been sacrificed and what had been gained. It was an exchange that had cost her, she would not deny that, but it had also allowed her child to live in a way that honored both her origins and the new things she had found. Later that night, Will and Nalin walked to the far end of the field where the horizon held the first hint of a low, gentle hill. The stars were bright and scattered. Will stopped and turned to her. "I want to ask you something," he said, and for a breath the world took the shape of a single question. Nalin's hand found his again. "Ask it," she said. Will's words were slow and careful, like everything else he offered. "Will you stay with me, not because you must, but because you choose to, so we can make a future that keeps Chenoa safe and gives her a life with 2 names and 2 songs?" He did not offer a ring or a speech. He offered a life shaped by daily things, work, bread, open doors. Nalin considered him, and then she thought of the night she had crossed the sleeping camp with a child at her breast, the terror and the fierce, precise love that had propelled her. She thought of the way Will had stood at the door that night, and later watched her with steady eyes as she tended beasts. She thought of Martha's quiet patience and of Takota's measured decision. These were not grand proofs, but small acts that added up into a promise she could trust. "I will stay," she said. "I will keep teaching her where she is from, but I will also make a home here. I choose this." The words were simple, and Will's face opened with a relief so full it was almost like weeping. They did not marry with a band of trumpets. Their commitment was made in the honest language of the ranch, a shared ledger of tasks, a promise to be truthful, an agreement to stand together when calls came. Will cleared a small space near the porch and built a lean-to where Nalin might keep her medicines and plants, a practical gift that was more eloquent than any gold. She, in turn, stitched his shirts and tied the leather around the saddles until they sat just so. The intimacy of their life was in these acts, the way hands met over work, the way they split bread and chores, the quiet conversation that turned into laughter. Spring became summer, and Chenoa grew with the easy certainty of a child loved. She learned to read proper words in books Martha kept on a shelf, and she learned to listen to Dakota's stories around the fire. Once when she was 8, Dakota pulled her close and told her a story of a river that had changed its course but still fed the land on both banks. "A river keeps both banks," he said. "So can a child keep both hearts that teach her." On a late afternoon when the sky glowed with gold and the horses grazed lazily, Dakota returned with the elders and brought a dish of dried fruit as a gift for Martha. They stayed for a while, and when they left, they did so with waves that were less formal than before. The necklace with which they had entrusted Nalin lay on a small lace in the home, more a symbol of memory than a shackle. The community change showed itself in the small margins. The cook pitched in more willingly to fix an extra hand stew. Frank stopped mocking Nalin's quietness and instead offered a curt, "Good work," that meant something more in his mouth than the words should have allowed. Julian the fence boy refused now to hide the admiration he felt for the way Nalin moved. The ranch had become a place that kept a person rather than simply used them. There were harder things, moments when an old grief would flare in Nalin's eyes, when she felt the empty place where a home had been and could not be restored by kindness alone. Will learned to sit with those silences, not to fill them, but to be there. Sometimes Dakota would find her in those quiet hours and speak of loss in a way that honored it and made space for moving forward. Those exchanges were not promises to erase what had been done. They were mutual acknowledgments that pain and new beginnings could coexist. One evening, as a low storm crept in from the west and the promise of rain made the air smell of ozone and thunder, the community gathered for a simple meal after a hard day's work. Children raced through the mud and shrieked with joy. Chenoa, now slightly older, rode a small mare with the bridle held by Nalin at first, and then by Will as the child learned to steer for herself. The sight caught something tender in Dakota's face. He approached the porch where Will and Nalin sat and set down a small box carved from wood. It was plainly made but with careful hands. "A thing to remember from the old days," he said, and then he looked at Chenoa as if the child were the future he might one day call kin. "May she carry the names we gave her," he added, "and may she also carry the work of this place." Inside the box was a cloth, and within it an old scrap of woven thread, perhaps from a garment that had lasted long. Nalin accepted it as if it were a benediction. There was no grand pronouncement, only the quiet of two worlds agreeing to stand beside one another. The seasons kept their course. In time, Nalin and Will's life settled into an ordinary beauty. Chores done in tandem, snow shoveled away in shared work, bread broken and passed. They raised Chenoa with an openness that let the child know both the names of the plants Nalin used and the ledger entries Will taught for counting. The little house by the porch filled with books and baskets and the smell of boiled herbs. The pendant hung on a peg in a place of honor, not as a chain but as a reminder. Years later, on an afternoon when the light slanted and the prairie seemed to hold its breath, Chenoa walked to the corral and climbed onto a small horse with a poise that showed she had learned both caution and courage. Will stood near, hands at his sides, proud and careful. Nalin watched with a kind of maternal joy that had the depth of someone who had nearly lost what she now held. Dakota rode up at a measured pace and slowed to the rhythm of the ranch. He watched the child as she guided the horse across the yard, the mare's hooves beating a slow, steady sound into the earth. When Chenoa passed the porch, she lifted her hand and smiled. Dakota nodded and then, in a small gesture, lay a hand on Nalin's shoulder that said more than words. A blessing not uttered but shown. At dusk, the three of them, Nalin, Will, and Chenoa, stood on the porch and watched the sun roll out a fire along the west. The house was warm, the animals settled, and the field held the last of the day's light. It was not a perfect world. There were debts to pay and old memories that would never be erased. But in that moment, there was a family formed by choice, knitted by the slow labor of respect and steady work. Nalin took Chenoa's small fist in her hand and felt the pulse of a child who had known hunger and then laughter. She thought of the midnight crossing that had seemed like everything and then like the first breath of a long life. She thought of Dakota's measured eyes and of Will's patient hands, of Martha's gentle teaching and Frank's gruff acceptance. She had not lost her past. She had built upon it. The evening deepened into navy and the first star pricked the sky. Will set a small light near the doorway and took Nalin's hand. They did not promise the world to one another. They promised to be present. That was the vow that mattered. "Whatever comes next," Will said, "we keep what we made together." "We made it," Nalin corrected, and the word held both gratitude and firm ownership. She leaned into him. "We made it," she agreed. Chenoa, tired from the ride, sat on the rail and traced letters in the dust with a stick, the way Martha had taught her. The pendant lay on a hook inside the house, catching the last light. The ranch's life hummed around them, animals breathing, a distant song, the soft creak of a porch under small feet. And in the small chorus of those simple sounds, there was a peace that had been carved from hard choices. A month later, when the sun sank low and the horizon flamed, Chenoa rode out across the field with both Will and Nalin watching close behind. The child's laugh carried back like bell notes. As she galloped for a moment toward the line of trees, the scene held the shape of a picture you could keep in your head. A child between two names, running into a future made of the careful materials of love and labor. If this story touched you, share your favorite moment below and watch another tale of courage and quiet change.